Cracking Economic Abstractions, Bringing Critical Theory Back In by Werner Bonefeld. This is from the Marx and Adorno book. I think that's what it's called. It's either called Marx and Adorno or Adorno and Marx. I can't remember. Now I feel like scrolling to the top of this nifty PDF. Rejecting naturalness on society. The opposite term to a critical theory of society is not uncritical theory. It is traditional theory, at least according to Max Horkheimer, who invoked the notion of a critical theory of society in his seminal essay, Traditional and Critical Theory of 1937, which I happen to have just read, and I'll put up on the YouTube soon. If one were to summarize the difference between them, at its best, traditional theory analyzes the world of real economic abstractions to comprehend their political, economic, cultural, psychological, social, and historical truth from various standpoints and comparative perspectives. Critical theory scrutinizes their untruth. It asks about the social constitution of the economic abstractions, and it asks about the historically specific character of the social relations that assume the form of a relationship between seemingly natural economic things. Critical theory thinks against the flow of the world, at least that is its intention. Critical theory does not deny that in capitalist social relations, the individuals are governed by the movement of real economic abstractions. Nor does it deny that their movement manifests itself as if by their own volition behind the backs of acting subjects. Indeed, critical theory accepts that in capitalist society, the social individuals are governed by inescapable economic laws that assert themselves as if by the force of nature, not just over, but also through and by means of them. Its acceptance does not entail affirmation of the economic things. On the contrary, it brushes the economic categories against their grain to reveal their origin in the capitalistically organized social relations. It is critique of economic nature as a socially constituted nature. Critical theory is critical on the condition that it dissolves the dogmatic appearance of capitalist society as a natural economic thing. It amounts, as Alfred Zone Rachel put it, to an anamnesis of the social origin or genesis of real economic abstraction. Critical theory thus argues that although the social relations vanish in their economic appearance, the inhospitable world of the abstract economic forces remains a human world. In capitalist society, the individuals are governed by the products of their own hands. That is, the social world manifests itself behind the backs of the individuals, and yet this manifestation and their, quote, enslavement to it is their own work. It is not the work of some transhistorically conceived logic of the productive forces that move history forward from one mode of production to another, as the positivist Marxists characterized by Adorno as, quote, perverters of Marxian motives, and, quote, believed it to be the case. For critical theory, historical materialism is not a theory of some abstractly conceived material logic of history. Rather, historical materialism is critique of the existing social relations in their form of appearance as relations of economic necessity. It is a critique of society, quote, understood as dogmatic, end quote. The truth of society as a relationship of real economic abstractions is the truth of the individuals as personifications, Marx, or character mask, Adorno, of their own social world. For a traditional theory of society, the notion of socio-economic necessity is an affront. It smacks of economic determinism, excludes the ideas of contingency and construction, creation and culture, and suggests dogmatic reduction of society to economic effect. Yet the traditional science of society is entirely founded on the presumption that labor economy is a natural phenomenon. As a natural phenomenon, society is identified by its structural properties, the study of which characterizes the domains of system theory. The idea of society as system leads to the introduction of the theory of social action to action for the behavior, and the idea of society as system leads to the introduction of the theory of social action to account for the behaviors and conflicts that characterize the subjective properties of human agency in the life world. In traditional social theory, society is seen neither as a system of structural properties or as a world of social action, and the perennial question is therefore whether society as a system is dominant or whether society as a world of action is decisive. However, the idea that society exists twice, once as system and then as acting subject, does not really reproduce in thought the appearance of society as a split reality of structure and agency. The dualism of thought is more apparent than real. Given the choice between society as economic system and society as action, social theory unerringly sides with the mischief of society as a system. Although the independent movement of the economic forces cannot be comprehended as such, its effects can be analyzed as instances of social contingency, which establish opportunity structures for the pursuit of distinct social projects at the expense of others. The so-called dialectics between structure and agency gives dialectics a bad name. It presumes what needs to be explained. The notion that modernity is the civilized manifestation of an unfolding logic of, by themselves, fathomable socio-economic forces and natural economic properties was articulated with lasting effect by Adam Smith, who viewed that what he called, quote, commercial society, end quote, as the final manifestation of a natural human propensity to truck and barter that weaves its way through society on the back of a dynamic of constant increases in the productivity of labor, which leads to an ever greater social division of labor and the establishment of a commercial society of generalized exchange relations. The nature of commercial society is magic. It transforms private vices into public virtues just like that is, by means of an invisible hand. Natural economic laws are laws of natural necessity. Nature cannot be changed. Nature can, however, be destroyed. Natural laws need to be harnessed to avoid destruction, and therefore, in order to survive, one has to adapt to those natural laws. The presupposition that labor is the productive means of social wealth in every society at any time shifts the focus of critical inquiry towards an argument about the most effective and just organization of labor economy. Instead of a critique of labor economy as an historically specific form of instead of a critique of labor economy as a historically specific form of definite social relations, its social nature is naturalized. Capitalist society appears as natural since it manifests itself in the form of a movement of economic quantities, of price and profit, and this movement is not only entirely uncontrollable by the individuals who comprise society, it is also hostile to them. At the blink of an eye, the economic movement of society can cut off a whole class of propertyless individuals, society's surplus value producers, from access to the means of subsistence. Just like that, indifferent to their needs and regardless of their efforts. Since nobody individually is in control, nobody individually can be blamed. Economic fate replaces the magic of religion within its own concept. In the form of economic fate, magic is disenchanted. It appears in the form of an invisible hand that, quote, takes care of both the beggar and the king, end quote. The invisible hand is the objective subject of reified society. The invisible hand cows and feeds on the society from which it springs, demanding submission on pain of ruin. A critical theory of society does not reject as mere illusion the natural invisible character of capitalist society. The fetish character of capitalist society is real. However, and in contrast to traditional theory, the fetish character of capitalist society does not conceive of capitalist society as a manifestation of some transhistorically unfolding economic nature. The circumstance that man has to eat does not in any way explain the form, content, and force of the capitalist economic categories. History and society, not some presumed economic nature, nor the hunter and gatherers with whom Smith began his natural history towards what he calls commercial society, is the critical starting point of inquiry into capitalist economic nature, its power and force, logic and necessity, and consciousness and will. Conceived as a critical social theory, the critique of political economy rejects the ontological conception of economic things as deceitful. The critique of political economy, instead, argues that the supposition that the economic laws of capitalist labor economy are founded on a natural propensity and are thus natural is entirely theological in its grasp of capitalist society. The natural, invisible character of capitalist society is, in its entirety, socially constituted, and social constitution holds sway in and through its economic appearance as a force of nature. That does nothing by itself. It is the acting subjects who, as personifications of the economic categories, endow the logic of economic matter with a consciousness and a will. It is true in capitalism people live by the economic forces to make a living, and by doing so they bestow them with an independent will, which appears in the form of society as a real economic abstraction. They do so without being aware of it. As a critical social theory, the task of the critique of political economy is to demystify the fetish character of the economic categories. It argues that the natural economic laws find their rational explanation through the understanding of definite forms of human social praxis. This practice only vanishes in the form of its appearance. It also appears in it as a practice of human personifications of their own social world. There is only one world, and that is the world in which we live. To the point of death, therefore, the life of all men hangs by the forces of capitalist economic nature. The idea that critical theory flouts traditional thinking entails thus more than it bargained for. It, quote, flouts tradition, end quote, only for as long and to the extent that critical theory retains consciousness of its own entanglement with the perverted world of economic inversion. It maintains this consciousness only for as long as it resists the comfort afforded by traditional theory. Traditional theory thinks about capitalist society as an object of analysis and economic calculation, or as an object of normative judgment about its promise of freedom. In contrast, critical theory thinks in and through capitalist society to subvert its natural objectivity. At least that is critical theory's critical intention. In this society, every individual is a coined individual, a living means and medium for the production of capitalist wealth that on the pain of ruin is accumulated for the sake of accumulation. Capital posits itself for the sake of surplus value to make money yield more money, or it does not with ruinous consequence. Wealth appears in the form of money that, quote, by virtue of being value, has acquired the occult ability to add value to itself, end quote, laying, quote, golden eggs, end quote. The freedom of the individual is a capitalized freedom, which is the freedom of a coined individual. The satisfaction of needs is a mere sideshow. The traditional theory of an economic nature that is regulated by an invisible hand identifies the vanished human subject and her needs as a metaphysical distraction that gets in the way of the calculation of a movement of economic qualities. In the words of Joan Robinson's despairing indictment of economic thought, quote, K is capital, delta K is investment. Then what is K? Why capital, of course. It must mean something, so let us get on with the analysis, and do not bother about those officious prigs who ask us to say what it means, end quote. Traditional thinking really is about things. In contrast, critical theory's attempt to think in and through things seeks out the vanished subject at the moment of the vanished subject's disappearance. Marx's notion of the critique of fetishism as an effort in deciphering the social constitution of economic things articulates the critical intent of his critique of political economy. It is to, quote, develop from the actual given relations of life the forms in which those given relations of life have become apotheosized, end quote. Horkheimer's conception of a critical theory of society then condemns as a social theory that does not doubt the natural character of society, takes explanatory refuge in invisible principles, and views the unfolding economic nature of society from different standpoints of analysis. From the standpoint of labor, it demands higher wages and better conditions, and rightly so. From the standpoint of capital, it demands enhanced labor productivity as a condition of global competitiveness, which is the condition for the sustained employment of labor. From the standpoint of the ecologist, it demands environmental protections. From the standpoint of normative ideals of social justice, it demands redistributive justice and equal opportunity. Then there is the view that capitalist economy manifests an irrational economy of labor, and from this, the thinking in normative orders derives the demand for a rationalized economy of labor that does not discriminate, exploit, and dominate the workers. And the logic of the matter, who conceptualizes that? Traditional theory either presupposes what needs to be explained, or explains what is already known, or it judges society on the basis of society's own normative projections, and it does so without a concept of society. Critical theory thus rejects positivism and positivism's philosophical equivalent of a science of knowledge, according to which the social facts speak for themselves, falsifying or verifying theoretical suppositions about their character. The economic fact that says loss of profitability imperils the prospect of sustained employment is an economic reality, and since man can only know what is given in the factual experience of reality, nothing more can be gleaned from the facts except that, for the sake of sustained employment, the profitable application of living labor is of the essence, on a world market scale. The paradigmatic manifestation of the traditional theory is social mathematics. It sets out to rationalize yesterday's movement of prices as a manifestation of a plurality of consumer value preferences, and on the basis of this direct and immediate calculus predicts tomorrow's utility movements of economic quantities. That is, it aggregates yesterday's economic behavior to measure today's deviation in order to predict tomorrow's price movements, with winning intent to gauge where to invest and what to sell. Quantities of, quote, capital are translated into algebra, which expresses, quote, utility movements, end quote, of wealth in the form of abstract symbols. As an exact science of moving economic quantities, economics articulates society as unaware of itself, in the form of calculable magnitudes of abstract wealth, of amounts of money that make more money, and society lives the better the more money it yields. In its more critical manifestation, traditional theory thinks in terms of normative orders. In the face of poverty, it constructs a normative argument for a freedom from want without asking once whether poverty is really just a coincidence of capitalist wealth, or whether it is in fact innate to capitalist wealth's concept. The freedom of labor is the freedom of trade and labor power. And what, given the normative ideal of social justice, ought this trade have to be like to meet the norms of fairness and social justice? In the meantime, the sellers of labor power continue to struggle to make a living. In conclusion, a traditional theory does not think in and through society. A traditional theory thinks about society. The traditional refusal to think out of things has important consequences for anti-capitalist arguments about how the things ought to be arranged. The following sections examine the elements of traditional anti-capitalism. I argue that it amounts at best to ticket thinking and at worst to a theological view. Contrary to the rumor about critical theory, its critique of existing conditions does not entail an impoverished praxis. Rather, it entails the question of praxis. What really does it mean to say, quote, no, end quote, in a society that is not only governed by the movement of economic abstractions, but also dependent on the movement of economic abstractions for that society's social reproduction? Society as subject. As a critical social theory, the critique of political economy holds that economics is the formula of an inverted and bewitched world. This stance raises the question about the meaning of critique in the critique of political economy. What is criticized? According to Marx, his critique of political economy amounts to a, quote, critique of economic categories, end quote, to reveal their origin in the historically specific social relations of production. Marx thus argued that, quote, end quote, economists deal with unreflected presuppositions. In the economist's hands, the, quote, law of capitalist accumulation is metamorphosed into a pretended law of nature, end quote. Time is money. Money is time. For the sake of wealth, that is, money as more money, time is of the essence. There is no time to lose. Fundamentally, the profitable investment of capital is not an end in itself. Rather, it is a means of avoiding default and bankruptcy. Quote, fanatically intent, end quote, on avoiding liquidation through, quote, the valorization of value, end quote, the capitalist, his personification of capital, a mere, quote, cog, end quote, recognizes the, quote, proletarian, end quote, as a, quote, machine for the production of surplus value, end quote. His, quote, drive towards enrichment, end quote, is the condition of preserving his capital, and he can only achieve this, quote, by means of progressive accumulation, end quote. Accumulation for the sake of accumulation. Regarding the sellers of labor power, their struggle to make ends meet is dependent upon the successful consumption of their living labor for profit, which is the condition of future sales and therefore sustained access to means of subsistence. The individuals act under the compulsion of the economic forces of time and money, and that is essentially more money in less time. Their freedom is the freedom of economic compulsion, which is the freedom of preserving capital by means of progressive accumulation, quote, ruthlessly forcing the human race to produce for production's sake, end quote. And it is the freedom of making ends meet on the part of a class of surplus value producers who struggle to dodge the, quote, freedom to starve, end quote. The class struggle belongs to the concept of capital. Since the individuals act under the compulsion of abstract economic forces, the point of critique cannot therefore be to, quote, make the individual responsible for relations whose creature he socially remains, however much he may subjectively raise himself above them, end quote. It is not sufficient to, end quote. It is not sufficient to criticize capitalists for their seemingly excessive addiction to profit, nor is it sufficient to criticize bankers for pursuing money for the sake of more money. On the pain of ruin, these behaviors manifest the, quote, objective necessity, end quote, of capitalistically constituted social relations. Neither the capitalist nor the banker, nor indeed the worker, can extricate themselves from the reality in which they live and which asserts itself only over them, but also through them, and by means of them. Their critique of the banker or any other politico-economic operative of a system that asserts itself as an independent force over and through the social individuals misses the object of critique. As a critical social theory, the critique of political economy is therefore not a critique of the personifications of economic categories. A critical social theory does not argue that the labor economy is corrupted by private interest of the capitalist and his political friends. It does not thereby demand political action to set things right, ostensibly in the interest of humanity and for the sake of a rationalized labor economy. Instead, it is a critique of the capitalistically organized social relations of human reproduction that assume the form of a movement of economic things, which objectify themselves in the person to the vanishing point of death. Nevertheless, while every individual is, quote, ruled by abstractions, end quote, the owner of great wealth experienced this rule as a source of great enrichment and power. In this context, Horkheimer and Adorno have argued that the, quote, rulers, end quote, are safe for as long as the, quote, ruled, end quote, struggle under the spell of the inverted world, in which, say, the cause of financial crisis, economic downturn, loss of employment, and wage income are attributed to the greedy behavior of identifiable individuals. A spellbound critique of capitalism demands more of this and less of that. It apportions blame and proclaims to know, quote, how to set things right. It identifies the wrongdoer and personalizes what is wrong. Rather than capital, it is the profit-making consciousness of the capitalist and the greed of the speculator that is criticized, rejected, and condemned. That is, the critique of the capitalist manifests itself as a demand for a better capitalism, one that works in the interest of the, quote, workers, end quote, or in today's parlance, the, quote, many, end quote. Marx's critique of Proudhon focuses on this simple point. Proudhon substituted the critique of capitalism for a critique of the capitalist, seeking to free capital from the capitalist so as to utilize the power of capital for the benefit of a well-ordered society, investing in society, and creating employment opportunities for the class of surplus value producers. The critique of the capitalist leaves the category of capital not only entirely untouched by thought, it also elevates, quote, capital as a thing beyond critique. Capital thus appears to be no more than an economic mechanism that can be made to work for this class interest or that class interest. In the end, it is the balance of the class forces that decides to which interest capital functions. Rather than touching the category of capital by thought, it identifies the guilty party, condemns the guilty party, and demands state action to sort things out and to set things right. It thus attributes miserable conditions to the activity of some identifiable individuals, who no longer appear as personifications of economic categories, but rather as the personalized subject of misery. This personalization of the economic categories entails a number of differentiations, most importantly between the productive or indeed creative capitalist as a, quote, producer, end quote, of, quote, real, end quote, wealth, employing a hard-working and creative people, and the financial or indeed parasitic capitalist who makes his fortune by speculating in money to the detriment of industry and workers. Here, the distinction between a use value production on the one hand and exchange value that manifests itself in the form of money on the other appears in the form of distinct personalities, pitting the creative industrialist against the parasitic banker-cum-speculator. Their interest, then, the idea of a capitalism that is corrupted by the financial interest. Finance turns capitalism into a casino at the expense of national industry, national wealth, national workers, and national harmony. The critique of financial imperialism entails the idea of anti-imperialism as a progressive liberating force. The reverse of anti-imperialism is national liberation. by which the dominated communities defend themselves against the disintegrating forces of financial globalization and imperial power. The idea of the nation as a subject of liberation is as irrational as the belief in a national destiny and a national homogeneity of purposes. From a national industry via the national interest to a national history. The idea of the nation as the foundation of being and becoming recognizes the term cosmopolitanism as a term of abuse. Instead, it idolizes the, quote, spirit of the people, end quote, as the imagined foundation of national being and becoming. If indeed it is permissible at all to speak about the national spirit of the people, it is a national spirit not by nature, but by a history of class struggle, by reducing history to nature, or by reading nature into history. The struggle for national liberation becomes delusional inasmuch as people are forced to act, quote, as if, end quote, they really are natural forces that have a national history. That is, a definite form of society manifests itself in the form of a movement of coins, and then, under the spell of this coined movement, rebels against the personifications of a world governed by coins. The personalized critique of capital identifies the, quote, wrongdoer, end quote, of the wrong society and calls him a merchant of greed. For the sake of employment and industry, something needs to be done. Something can be done. The personalized critique of capitalist social relations is open to abuse from the outset. It thinks akin to a register of blame and condemns the identified party as a power that hides behind the economic phenomenon, sucking the living life out of the national community of a hard-working people. The identification of the subject of misery leads to the condemnation of the world market society of capital as a network of money and power that for the sake of financial gain destroys the livelihood of a national people, a victim of cosmopolitan peddlers. Society as object. The headlines of misery have changed from war and terror to what seem like a never-ending global economic crisis, pre- and post-pandemic, yet war and terror continue unabated. In this context, the notion that capitalism produces deplorable situations is a most optimistic point of view. Deplorable situations are not the same as deplorable conditions. The latter says that poverty is a capitalist condition. Challenging it requires a fundamental change in the social relations of production. In distinction, deplorable situations describe entirely avoidable socioeconomic circumstances, be they the result of chance developments, government incompetence, pandemics, or hard-nosed class politics. As such, it can be rectified by well-meaning political interventions and political programs that benefit society at large. Miserable situations require resolution by political means that hold the economy accountable to the democratic demands of the social majority. Deplorable situations require thus a socio-political activism that challenges this misery and that outrage, seeking to alleviate this inequality and that injustice, to rectify this and that. Critical theory looks beyond the contingent to grasp capitalism's fundamental condition. The activism of the given situation feels the pain of the world, and it might succeed in making capitalist society more equal, inclusive, fair, and just. Nevertheless, the, quote, activism, end quote, of the deplorable situation is not only affirmative of existing society. It is also delusional about the character of fairness, justice, and equality in capitalism. It is based on the conviction that, however bad the situation, it can be rectified for good by this intervention or that policy, by this or that technical means, by this welfare support and that public policy, for the sake of fairness, justice, and freedom, the end of suffering and misery, and the overcoming of exploitation, discrimination, and inequality. It seeks a capitalism that works in the image of its normative ideal, without a question raised about what lays within it. In this manner, the activism of the situation transforms the protest against a really existing misery that blights the life of a whole class of individuals into a selling point for political gain. There is, says Adorno, a need for a, quote, practice that fights barbarism, end quote. Barbarism cannot be fought in a direct and immediate manner. What really does it mean to struggle against money, resist the movement of coins, combat the law of economic value, resist the coined freedom of capitalist profit, and fight poverty in a system of social reproduction that contains the pauper in its conception of its wealth? To put this point differently, the humanization of social relations is the purpose and end of the struggle for human emancipation from relations in which man is a degraded being governed by real economic abstractions. Should the effort at humanizing capitalist society's treatment of its workers succeed, the better for the poor and miserable. Humanized profit-making is much preferable to the slaveholder's whip, and worse. Humanizing capitalism prevents it from descending into social catastrophe with ease. Its efforts sustain the precarious crust of civility in bourgeois society. Adorno's revision of Kant's categorical imperative, according to which one should recognize and treat man never as a means but always as a purpose, is apt. Quote, Hitler has imposed a new categorical imperative upon humanity in the state of their unfreedom, to arrange their thinking and conduct so that Auschwitz never repeats itself, so that nothing similar ever happen again, end quote. The effort at humanizing fetters the state of unfreedom with golden chains. However, the effort of humanization presupposes inhuman conditions, and is thus confronted by the paradox that it presupposes as eternal, those same conditions that provoke the effort of humanization in the first place. Inhuman conditions are not just an impediment to humanization, but a part and parcel of the concept of humanization. What then does it mean to say no? It is easy to say what is wrong. It is, however, quite impossible to say what is right in the negative totality of capitalist society. Adorno captures the difficulty of saying no well when he argues that the quote, total movement of society, end quote, is, quote, antagonistic from the outset, end quote. That is to say, quote, society stays alive not despite its antagonism, but by means of its antagonism, end quote. Contrary to traditional Marxism, class struggle is not something positive. Rather, class struggle belongs to and characterizes the negative world and drives the negative world forward. Class struggle for access to the means of life does not express an ontologically privileged position, according to which the working class is the driving force of historical progress. Rather, to be a productive worker is a, quote, great misfortune, end quote. That is to say, class is not a positive category. Class is a negative category. Class is a category of the false society, one that posits a mass of dispossessed laborers as producers of surplus value, and one that concentrates the means of life as means of profit at the disposal of a few hands. The critique of class society does not find it positive. The critique of class society does not find its positive resolution in the achievement of fair and just exchange relations between the buyers of labor power and the producers of surplus value. The critique of class society finds its positive resolution only in a society in which the progress of the, quote, muck of ages has come to an end, in the classless society. A constructive critique of class society, one that wants to do good for the surplus value producers, is entirely traditional in its account of society. It posits the observable fact of class division, classifies the individuals according to their observed market positions and occupations, takes into account income levels and educational achievement, and calculates with predictive intent the probability of conflict and acquiescence. It posits class and affirms what it is posited. In its practical dimension, it amounts, argue Horkheimer and Adorno, to, quote, ticket thinking, end quote. Such thinking is one-dimensional. 1 second. There you are, you slow little bastard. Okay. Oh, come on, man. Sorry. This is fucking annoying. Why do I use Adobe Acrobat? It seriously works like shit. Isn't this supposed to be like the cream of the crop of PDF readers? I swear to God, I don't have problems like this in the past. But, let's see. Come on, you fucker. God. Shoot me in the fucking face. Oh my fucking God. Getting so mad here. I'm gonna put my thumbs through my eyes. Well, I've learned a lesson. I can't do multiple things with my computer while I'm reading these stuff, because it's just going to interrupt me and throw off the whole thing, and it's going to close Adobe Acrobat, and I'm going to be sitting here and talking to myself like a fucking psychopath. Alright. God, this is so fucking stupid. Alright. I think I'm back on the page, man. I'll have to fucking... A constructive critique of class society, one that wants to do good for the surplus value producers, is entirely traditional in its account of society. It posits the observable fact of class division, classifies the individuals according to their observed market positions and occupations, takes into account income levels and educational achievements, and calculates with predictive intent the probabilities of conflict. and acquiescence. It posits class and affirms what is posited. In its practical dimension, it amounts, argue Horkheimer and Adorno, to, quote, ticket thinking, end quote. Such thinking is one-dimensional. It rejects the critique of class society by speaking out for the working class with a claim to power. That is, it demands a shift in the balance of class forces to set things right, ostensibly on behalf of the class tied to work, seeking a better deal for the wage slaves. Ticket thinking proclaims falseness. Ticket thinking does, quote, not talk about the devil, end quote. By putting forth a program of social transformation without thought about the conceptuality of capitalist wealth, ticket thinking, quote, looks on the bright side, end quote, and proclaims falseness. Its falseness is not untrue. It identifies the existing conditions of misery and makes it seem as if they present a mere pathology of capitalist wealth. This stance articulates an objective illusion. It supposes that all would be well if only government were to stand up to the capitalist interest in their imperialist backers. The illusion says that the profitable accumulation of money that yields more money does not really count, that what counts is the satisfaction of human needs. It says that the failure to make a profit entails no threat to social reproduction, that what counts is not profit but human beings. It suggests that the life of the class tied to work does not hang by the success of turning her labor into profit as the fundamental condition of achieving wage-based access to the means of life. What counts is goodness. It says that debt is not a mortgage on future surplus value. What counts is consumption. It rejects as absurd that useful things that cannot be turned into profits are burned. What counts is use-value production. It rejects as unfounded the insight that in the capitalistically organized social relations, quote, the needs of human beings, oh my fucking god. This is going to be one unlistenable MP3. I feel like I should be making banter, like a band between songs during a tune-up. I got nothing to say. I'm sweating. Is that interesting information? And it's going to take me right back to... I'm going to be so pissed. Christ on the fucking cross. I'm gonna fucking shoot this computer. I'm gonna blow its fucking head off. It rejects as absurd that useful things that cannot be turned into profits are burned. What counts is use-value production. It rejects as unfounded the insight that in the capitalistically organized social relations, quote, the needs of human beings, the satisfaction of human beings is never more than a sideshow, end quote. It opposes money as capital, money prime, and instead it considers money as a means of purchasing commodities. Commodity, money, commodity, and demands that money be put in the pockets of workers to strengthen their purchasing power, connecting them more firmly to the means of subsistence. The exchange of labor power, commodity, for money, that is, then exchanged for means of subsistence, commodity, money, commodity, is, however, a function of money, commodity, money prime. Profitable employers purchase labor power. Unprofitable employers do not purchase labor power. Profit-making is the means of avoiding bankruptcy, and for the sake of sustained access to the means of subsistence, the sellers of labor power depend on the profitable exploitation of their labor by, quote, money bags, end quote. The illusion of the epoch suggests that profits do not matter. What matters is the well-being of workers. The illusion of the epoch confuses the reality of capitalism with its illusory promise of freedom from want. The illusion of the epoch identifies what really counts, and yet it leaves the economic categories untouched by thought. It does not recognize the very society that it rejects abstractly. Only a reified consciousness can declare that it is in possession of the requisite knowledge, political capacity, and technical expertise and know-how, not only for resolving capitalist crises, but also to do so in the interest of the class that works. For the sake of progress, it demands a rationalized labor economy, equitable exchange relations, and fair working conditions. Quote, abstract negativity, end quote, barks in perpetuity and without bite. Instead, it sniffs out the miserable world from the outside, as it were, and puts itself forward as having the capacity, ability, insight, and means for organizing capitalist economy for the workers, securing the full employment of the class that lives by labor. Abstract negativity describes the theology of anti-capitalism. Theologically conceived, anti-capitalism is devoid of now-time. Instead, it views the present as transition towards its own future, promising deliverance from misery amid a, quote, pile of debris, end quote, that, quote, grows skyward, end quote. Postscript. Society as struggle. For a critical theory of society, the critical concept of inquiry is not hegemony, it is governmentality. Each individual carries her bond with society in her wallet. Everybody lives for money. For the sake of making a living, she needs to make money. Money does not only make the world go round, money's possession also establishes a connection to the means of life. As such, the class struggle is a struggle for money. It governs the mentality of bourgeois society, from the struggle for employment over wages and conditions and against redundancy. What is misery? In the face of great social wealth, the propertyless sellers of labor power struggle for fleeting amounts of money to sustain themselves as producers of surplus value. There is a fate far worse than being an exploited worker, and that is to be an unexploitable worker. For the sake of making a living, what is the price of a kidney? Especially in miserable times, it is important to understand that the struggle for the society of human purposes does not follow some abstract idea. It is a struggle for access to, quote, crude and material things without which no refined and spiritual thing could exist, end quote. What then are the dispossessed surplus value producers struggling for? Quote, in itself, end quote. They struggle for access to the means of subsistence to satisfy their human needs. They struggle for wages and conditions. They struggle to defend wage levels and conditions. They struggle against capital's, quote, werewolf's hunger for surplus labor, end quote, and its destructive conquest for additional atoms of unpaid labor time, and thus against the reduction of their life to mere time's carcass. They struggle against a life constituting solely of labor time, and thus against a reduction of human life to a living resource. They struggle for respect, education, and recognition of human significance, above all for food, shelter, clothing, warmth, love, affection, knowledge, time for enjoyment, and dignity. They struggle as a class, quote, in itself, end quote. Their struggle as a class, quote, in itself, end quote, really is a struggle for, quote, for itself, end quote. For life, human distinction, lifetime, and above all, satisfaction of basic human needs. The working class does not struggle for socialism. It struggles to make a living. It struggles for access to the means of life and for comfort. It does all this in conditions in which the increase in material wealth that it has produced pushes beyond the limits of its capitalist form of wealth, money that yields more money for the sake of more money. Every so-called trickle-down effect that capitalist accumulation might bring forth presupposes a prior and sustained trickle-up in the capitalist accumulation of wealth. And then society, quote, suddenly finds itself put back into the state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence, end quote. The struggle of the dispossessed does not express an ontological privilege. It is, quote, dictated by hunger, end quote. The existence of the social individuals as personifications of seemingly self-moving economic forces does not entail the reduction of social consciousness to economic consciousness. It entails the concept of economy as an experienced concept of struggle to overcome misery, and economic consciousness as an experienced consciousness of suffering. For the propertyless, sellers of labor power, economic consciousness is an unhappy consciousness. This is the unhappy consciousness of the struggle for access to the means of life. It is this struggle that makes the oppressed class the depository of historical knowledge. Instead of thinking about history, one needs instead to think out of history, out of the battles for freedom, slave insurrections, peasant revolts, the struggles of les enragés, working class strikes, riots, insurrections, and revolutions, to appreciate the traditions of the oppressed, recognize the smell of danger and stench of death, gain a sense of the courage and cunning of struggle, grasp the spirit of sacrifice, and comprehend, however fleetingly, the density of a time at which the progress of the muck of ages almost came to a standstill. Class struggle, quote, supplies a unique experience with the past, end quote. Whether this experience, quote, turns concrete in changing forms of repression as resistance to repression, or whether it turns concrete in forms of repression, end quote, is a matter of experience history. A definite logic holds sway in real economic abstraction. Its secret history is the sheer unrest of life. Thanks for listening despite those interruptions.